Behind my title is a really rather interesting kind of idea, which I'm pulling a whole load of material together from various sources, and I'm going to be talking quite a lot about Apollo and the idea of Apollo. So let's have a look at Apollo. This is a Roman carving of Apollo, and he's always seen as a handsome, unshaven youth, of course, a Greek god, holding the lyre and standing by a tree trunk with a snake wound round it. This snake is Python, who he has an early encounter with. Python represents divination, or an oracular kind of skill associated with Apollo. The lyre is the musical instrument, but he has one other thing that he's associated with, and that is the bow. So the bow, the lyre, and divination are the three main features of this extraordinary god. And here's a kind of modern view of him. So if we look at his attributes, just briefly, he's associated with music, poetry, and the arts, medicine and healing, and strangely enough, producing plague, generating plague in cities, which is quite an extraordinary kind of negative thing to have. Truth and prophecy. He's the god of archery. He's associated with mathematics and astronomy. And in later times, in Greece and in Rome, he's associated with the sun. He's a solar god. He's associated with drawing the sun across the sky in a chariot. But really the most interesting thing about him in some respects is that he's a late comer to the Greek pantheon. He's a late god, and he seems to come from somewhere different. So let's just have a look at a traditional picture of him on a Greek vase. Here he is standing on the Delphic oracular place on the tripod where the Pythoness is going to traditionally be. That's the priestess of Delphi, the oracle, who for hundreds of years, lots of different priestesses of course, gave the oracular answers to questions in this extraordinary place, founded by Apollo. And here he is with his lyre, his bow, and his sitting in the oracular position. I'm just getting up my little red pointer in case I can see. This is the tripod here. We have to just tell you a bit about his mum. His mum is called Leto. She's a very revered goddess because she was rather beautiful, and Zeus fancied her like he fancied everybody. And very quickly, she was seduced by Zeus and gave birth to Artemis. Artemis is the sister of what will be Apollo. But the interesting thing about her is she's associated with being a she-wolf in the northern place that we call Hyperborea, the place of the north winds. Nobody knows exactly where Hyperborea is. Some people have suggested that it was north of Thrace or north of the Black Sea, but there are other people who finger more Western Europe and see it as possibly in the British Isles, and I'll be mentioning that a little bit later on. So after having Artemis, which was a very straightforward birth and so on and so forth, she disappeared up into Hyperborea for a while and then came down again to the Aegean area, where Zeus coupled with her again, and she became pregnant. And this time, Zeus's wife Hera was furious. And she put out an edict saying there's no way that Leto can have her birth, have her baby on any solid land. It was quite impossible, and she knew she couldn't have it in the sea. And then some other gods very, very gently allowed an island to appear floating on the Aegean called Delos. And it was untethered, and it was very barren, and she had her baby there, and it was a long and difficult birth. And at the moment Apollo was born, there was a great bright light over the whole island. And at the same time, a whole mass of swans came around the island, so the swan gets associated with this god. And he was quite a guy because she introduced him to the Olympian pantheon of gods, and when he walked in the room or whatever they have at the top of Mount Olympus, all the gods went, wow, and actually stood up. And she was the only person who was allowed to be seated, and this becomes a very traditional kind of representation of Leto. And of course, when he was born, he made one of those utterances like all famous people do. Dear to me shall be the lyre and the bow, and in my oracles I shall reveal to man the inexorable will of Zeus. So he was kind of honoring his father. So he's always associated with oracular wisdom in this kind of way. Here's another picture of him at the time of his birth. And this is really very important. You can see him standing, well, he's kind of being born by his mum here. This is Leto. He's traditionally born by some palm trees. And he's immediately, as soon as he's born, holding his very nice Greek composite bow. This is his big sister now, Artemis, sitting in front, looking a bit pregnant, or maybe she's just lifting her knee. I'm not quite sure on the vase. And this monster at the end here is called Python, or Putheos. And his monster's been sent by Hera to destroy this family. She's furious those births managed to take place. But little Apollo fires his arrow and immediately kills the monster here. Hera is furious and sends another monster called Delphinus, but he's killed, or she's killed, with another arrow, and then a huge giant called Titias, and he's killed as well. So the point I'm making is these arrows are pretty special, and this archer is pretty special. This is Apollo. Here he is again, just to remind you, with these three key things: the oracle, the lyre, and the arrows. Now, I mentioned earlier on Hyperborea. Let's just find out what Diodorus Siculus, that writer between 80 and 20 BCE, or before Christ, if you like, was writing about Hyperborea. You wouldn't imagine so on a day like this, if this is Hyperborea, but in the regions beyond the land of the Celts, and there is some new material which suggests that the Celts were really known to the Greeks as being around about southern Spain. So if we're going to look up beyond southern Spain to an island that's smaller than Sicily, we could finger the British Isles with some confidence. It's situated in the north and inhabited by these Hyperboreans, and the island is both fertile and productive of every crop and has an unusually temperate climate. Well, it did then, more so than it does now. And also Diodorus Siculus linked in Apollo straight away, because he said the moon on this island seems to be bigger than it is in other places. And Apollo actually comes to the island. Remember, his mother possibly originated from here. Apollo comes every 19 years, which reminds us of the major standstills of the moon. So this is straight away a kind of astronomical link. And he plays upon his harp, that's his lyre, and he sings and dances every night from the vernal equinox right through to the appearance of the Pleiades, which is in late July. So every 19 years, this god returns to Hyperborea and plays out this incredible astronomical kind of ritual with songs that get known as the Apollo songs, or the Apollo paean. And the Greeks really took this idea really very seriously. And the other interesting thing about Apollo is that he was born on the 7th day of the lunation, the maximum day of waxing energy. So he's already been linked in a very interesting way with kind of lunar ideas. Also, Diodorus Siculus said of Hyperborea that here Apollo has a stately grove with a renowned temple of a round form, beautified with many gifts. Well, many of you will recognize that as being the Stonehenge gift shop. And that this is indeed Stonehenge. I mean, whether it's Stonehenge or not, nobody knows. But various authorities have speculated that it might be. We're not quite sure. And then he also told us that Apollo has to him a city consecrated, whose citizens are great harpers. And there's a tradition that the Celtic peoples, even in Greek times, were people associated with playing the Celtic harp and were great musicians. And then finally, the sovereignty of this city was dedicated most definitely to Apollo. So the whole idea of Apollo kind of originating from Hyperborea was a serious idea in Greek thinking.